Thank you to the Royal Historical Society and to the Selection Committee for shortlisting my book, In the Shadow of Justice, for the Gladstone Prize. It's a great honour to be on the shortlist along so many wonderful books. Now, In the Shadow of Justice is a book about the transformation of liberal political philosophy that took place in the US and elsewhere in the second half of the 20th century. At one level, it's a book about the political philosopher John Rawls and about the circle of philosophers that formed around him. It's about how Rawls's theory, which was published in its most influential statement in 1971 as a theory of justice, it's about how that theory became a kind of doctrine. Rawls invented a new conceptual vocabulary and a novel framework for political philosophy. Many political philosophers had said the field died during the Second World War, when it became impossible to think about justice or utopia. Thanks to the prevailing liberal anti-totalitarianism, a slippery slope to authoritarianism was seen behind every progressive reform, and Rawls was seen as changing all of that. He was heralded as reviving political philosophy from its slumbers. After Rawls, political philosophers focused their attention on theories of distributive justice, about who gets what, and on how much and what kind of inequality was permissible. In the 10 years following 1971, when the book was published, the subject matter of philosophy was transformed. A new theory, liberal egalitarianism, was constructed and consolidated. Rawls's concepts set the terms of philosophical debate for generations. Now, his probably most famous idea was the famous veil of ignorance, the original position in which his two principles of justice are chosen. But he was also famous among philosophers for many others. Now, in his wake, justice theory became dominant, and today we are all in his shadow. So this is a success story. It's about how one theory came to be the referent, the touchstone for so many others. And in my book, I explore where Rawls's theory came from, where it went, and how political philosophy was transformed by it, and how political philosophers used, adapted, and expanded it to confront novel political challenges. Now, Rawls's theory, as well as the approach to doing political philosophy that was born alongside it, the philosophy of public affairs, remains crucial for philosophers today, especially those thinking about equality, global justice, about climate change in the future, and about the way institutional changes are justified in liberal democracies. So on the one hand, there's this story of philosophical triumph that my book tells. Now, on the other hand, this is also a book with a critical intent that begins from the thought that all theory is entangled with its ideological and political context. Now, my training is in the history of political thought, and when I set out to write this book, I wanted to understand the particular ways that this particular philosophy was entangled with politics in the post-war United States. Now, political philosophy since Rawls has often looked pretty abstract, so it can be easy to miss that it has its own politics, its own ideological force, and its own history. Now, some critics have suggested that that history is an ironic one. When you put the politics and history back in the story of liberal egalitarianism, Rawls's theory can seem remarkably untimely. Liberal egalitarianism came to dominance just as progressive politics were fracturing with the rise of the new right. And Rawls's theory, that great philosophical defense of the welfare state, appeared to come on the eve of its crisis. Now, seen against this backdrop, on this view, the triumph of liberal egalitarianism isn't only a success story. Now, what I suggest in my book, however, is that it isn't simply an ironic story of bad timing either. It's also a ghost story in which Rawls's theory lived on as a spectral presence long after the conditions it described were gone. Political philosophy remains haunted by Rawls's theory, but that theory came from a particular time and place and a particular ideological constellation of post-war American liberalism, a fact which itself has a series of implications for what kinds of egalitarianism was possible in the aftermath of the post-war, and what the effects of that egalitarianism has been as liberalism itself has also transformed. In the Shadow of Justice explores these origins and these effects and these implications. It tells the story of the rise to dominance of a certain way of doing political philosophy and a particular form of liberal ideology. It tracks the rise of this dominant paradigm, its strengths, its limits, its blind spots, showing where Rawls's theory went, how it was used in debates about environmentalism, decolonization in the 1970s, how egalitarian philosophers then responded to the rise of neoliberal ideologies in the 1980s, and how the critics of Rawlsianism struggled to find alternatives to Rawls, but often ended up merely mirroring the ideas they wanted to dispute. So this is a history of 20th century political thought, but it's also a history of the present. What I argue in the book is that many of the 20th century alternatives to Rawlsianism couldn't escape it. They ended up operating within the shadow of justice theory. And it is that shadow I want to suggest that we need to try to get out from under if we're going to deal with our own questions and our own crises today. So thank you for watching, and thank you for reading.